And also, my friend David Amram, if he's still around here, he said that he was going to join me a little bit. But while he makes his way out here, I'm going to share the story with you really briefly, and then read an excerpt from my book, Mañana Means Heaven. In 1947, Jack Kerouac was traveling through the San Joaquin Valley in California, where I'm from, originally born and raised there. And he met a farm worker woman by the name of B. Franco, who he called Terry. What was little known is that, after he had written his book On the Road, that he was, trying to get it published, and maybe as we all know, he had some difficulty getting that book published for about 6, 7 years. And it wasn't until he published the excerpt called The Mexican Girl in the Paris Review that Viking opened the doors to the publication of that novel. In 2010, earlier than that, I had been interested in that character of Terry because that's where I'm from. I was living in Boulder at the time, and I just thought, I wonder whatever happened to her. Very sort of casual question, right? I wonder what happened to this woman. And I moved back to Fresno, California that year, 2008, and I began to kind of just poke around, wondering, who had written what about her, and just kind of trying to find out more information. To tell you the short story long version, I found out that she was still alive, and she was 90 years old, and she lived 1.5 miles down the road from my house in Fresno. So I knocked on her door, and we began a friendship, and I started to interview her and ask her version of that story. And from that story, from those interviews, I wrote this book, Mañana Means Heaven, based on Kerouac's own words when he talks about the labor camps in the San Joaquin Valley, and he says, mañana, mañana, it's all I hear them say, and it's a lovely word, and for all I know, it means heaven. And for Terry, for B. Franco, mañana did mean heaven, in fact. And I'm going to read you this. I'm going to actually, I'm going to start with the end, toward the end, just because it's Denver-centric. And, I was working for the Colorado Humanities and Center for the Book here at the time, it was on Colfax and Lafayette. And I would go across the street to the cafe, and during my lunch breaks, write the rest of the book with her in Denver. Because during our interviews, I would ask her, where in California? No, I said, have you ever been outside of California, B? And she said, well, her son and her daughter were there. And she said, well, and her son and daughter were like 70 and 69 years old. And she goes, and her son and daughter answered for her. They said, well, Mom's never been out of California. She's always been home. She's just a farm worker, and she's just been home. And then she said, well, I was in Mexico once. And they said, oh, yeah, that's right, Mom, that's right. You went to Mexico, and your dad, and then she was part of the Repatriation Act when they were deporting Mexicans. In fact, she was born in Los Angeles. The first thing I asked her, actually, was I said, how do you feel about being known as the Mexican girl? And she said, well, I'm not Mexican. I was born in Los Angeles. But she was sent back to Mexico, to Guanajuato, where her father was from anyways, in 1930. And that's how my book begins. But so then I'd come back because she was 90 years old, and it was not like I could ask her questions chronologically, tell me from the day you were born till now. Her mind was just thinking non-linearly. And so I would ask her the same questions every time I'd go back. And I said, second time I went to interview her, I said, hey, B, so have you ever been outside of California? And then her children said, well, yeah, my mom told you the last time she was in Mexico, and she said, I was in Chicago once. Mom, you were in Chicago? Yeah, it was a long time ago. I was crazy. What were you doing in Chicago? I was just out there trying to make a life. I thought it would be interesting. And I had heard about Chicago, and I wanted to go to Chicago. Coincidentally, she was in Chicago the same year Kerouac was in Chicago. I went back the next time, and I said to her, hey, B, have you ever been outside of California? And her children said, yeah, she told you she was in Mexico. Remember Chicago, that whole thing, Chicago? She was in Chicago. She goes, I lived in Denver once. And her children went, who is this woman? It was like, and I said, so what did you do in Denver? And she said, I had met a friend who told me that, he knew I was a waitress. He knew I was a waitress at the time. And he told me that there were some great restaurants in Denver that I could probably make some good money at, and that I should meet him there. So I'm going to start with that section. It's only about 1.5 pages. It's pretty short. Denver was like any place she had ever seen. It certainly wasn't Los Angeles, definitely nothing like Selma, California. In either of those places, you couldn't walk more than 2 steps without hearing Spanish flavoring the wind. But here, way up in the Rocky Mountains, people spoke and and moved with a different attitude altogether. The first morning after she'd stopped by Jack's place again, only to discover he wasn't home, she found herself on the banks of the winding Platte River. There she gazed toward the Scarlet Mountains, listening to the soft applause of the Union Pacific trains shuddering in the distance. She stood there for a long while, silent and alone. Of course, it was not the same kind of aloneness that she had found while sitting in the Campo tent in Selma, California. No, this aloneness had a quality of purpose, as if she were meant to be right where she was. She spent that whole afternoon walking the arched spine of Colfax Avenue, ducking in and out of the speakeasies and small diners and whiskey joints, searching for him. At one point, she stumbled on a park, a quaint spot near East High School, where teenage boys huddled around benches and smoked cigarettes. They were red-faced youth, all of them, shabby clothes, hard hands, the type that chopped logs on weekends at the family farm. They whistled at Bea. When she walked past, she ignored them, clutched her purse. She pulled her warm blue sweater up over her chest. Above her, the sky continued to unscroll its dramatic swashes of light and dark, with vast dollops of clouds that practically moaned. They were so obese, they languished across the plains east toward Kansas. There was a melancholy sight. They were a melancholy sight. She couldn't help but feel that way about everything in this moment. She pressed on, scanning all the corners and cracks of Denver. At Park Avenue, she stopped to watch a young family cross the street. The children's hands were interlinked, and they bounced along joyfully, squawking like a row of homebound geese. She wondered what it would be like living here with her children, little Al and Patsy, in a city like this. How very different it would be from the valley that she knew, that she loved. Had it not been for this vision, though, that she carried close to her for the rest of the day, she might have allowed herself to feel dismal about the fact that finding Jack was proving far more difficult than she had anticipated. That's that chapter. And so I'm going to finish with this last page and a half, and I'm going to invite my good friend David Amram, David, come on up, please. Such a pleasure. Such an honor, man. Mi hermano. Yes, who I just had recently the pleasure of meeting in Okemah, Oklahoma, of all places, the Woody Guthrie Festival. And we chatted, and here we are. Thank you for being here with me. All right. Chapter 22, Wednesday, October 22nd, 1947. The workers couldn't stop talking about it, especially that whole first day after it had happened. According to the newspapers, a wetback was found strung up in a sycamore tree near Raisin City. From his neck dangled a cardboard sign, "Parasite." The Fresno County coroner confirmed that because nowhere on the body were there bruises or scrapes, the only logical explanation was suicide. A common occurrence among braceros, they said. Naturally, they miss their families back home. Depression is inevitable, fear constant, the food too bland, a bottle of whiskey found half emptied nearby. And for Sixto Martinez, all the signs were there. On this very day, his contract was up. As for that brief poem found on his person, the paper offered no explanation, except to say, Mr. Martinez had a way with words, he was known. It was imminent now. The way Sixto died was just a suggestion. The workers all knew this. They thought hard about that as they bent over their vines that morning in a solemn daze. The fields were gray with dew, and each grape wore a thin veil of film so that its sheen was hidden. So quiet were the rows and the shuffling of the feet that morning that swallowtails perched themselves on the branches, the vines, and plucked the smaller grapes at will. As if things weren't bad enough, a cold snap had crept in over Devil's Ridge from the north, settling into the San Joaquin Valley. That morning, Bee's hands moved faster than anybody else's. Box after box was filled and carted off to be weighed and counted, and within seconds, she was right back to where she'd left off on that same tendril, making sure the job was done and done right, and that every last grape was accounted for. She passed other workers as if they were standing still. And for the most part, they were. It seemed everyone was busy scratching their heads, wondering if today was the day the raid would go down. They would eye Jack suspiciously, wondering if those rumors they had heard were true. A lechuza, they called him, a white owl in their midst. For the most part, he got good at ignoring their accusatory glares. Meanwhile, Bee kept saying the words, New York, in her mind. New York, she would say, New York. And while her feet were sunk firm in wet soil, the rest of her, it may have well have been in a subway barreling down the spine of Manhattan. She thought about what her brother Alex had told her. 5 days, Bee, just 5 more little days, he mumbled. She passed the time picturing her new life with Jack, imagining the big smell of New York City, watching her kids monkey around the playground of some brick schoolyard she'd seen in the magazines. She lifted another box of grapes, hauled them to be counted off. Jack trailed one row back. He cut away viciously with his curved knife all the knots, all the tendrils that cradled the grape deep in their clutches. His gaze was stern, removed, and his pink face glowed in the cold. Little Albert, Bee's son, nipped at his heels, raking out whatever clusters went overlooked, and he would put them down into Jack's box like the little handy assistant that he was. Each time he did this, he would look up to Jack for approval, a smile, anything to erase that worrisome look on his face. Jack watched the way the boy handled his knife, how that little boy shot around the whole field effortlessly, offering a hand here and there, the way he'd call out to other workers in Spanish, whistling the whole way. He was a little man doing big man's work, and Jack had taken notice that these fields had an army of these little men workers, boys whose small hands were crucial to the whole operation. Every last one of them wore a defeated mask. And if you looked at them from a distance, he reasoned, you'd think they were full-grown men by the way they stood, hips squared, shoulders back. The only way you could tell the boys apart from the adults was at lunchtime, when they'd gather around a hole in the dirt to shoot marbles. Jack observed this, and he shook his head, and he remembered a line from one of the greatest scribes of this territory, William Saroyan, who said it best about such children of the valley, when Saroyan said, I was a little afraid of him. Not the boy himself, but what he seemed to be, the victim of the world. Thank you so much. Thank you. And thank you, David Amram, also.